The shot came from nowhere. One crack of a musket in the early morning fog, and the world changed forever. Nobody knows who fired it. Nobody ever will. But that single anonymous bullet set in motion a chain of events that would tear apart the most powerful empire on Earth and birth a nation that had never existed before. Here is what most people never stop to consider. In 1776, the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were not brave visionaries standing on the right side of history. They were, in the eyes of British law, traitors. And traitors hanged. They knew it. Every one of them knew it when they picked up the pen. That is the detail that changes everything, because it means every choice made in that year, every battle fought, every cold night endured, was made in the shadow of a noose. If you want to understand what it truly felt like to live inside the American Revolution, not the textbook version, not the paintings and the monuments, but the mud, the fear, the impossible hope of it, stay with us. Subscribe now, because what we are about to show you is the revolution as it was actually lived, and it is nothing like what you were taught. Cast your mind back to the summer of 1776, not to Philadelphia, where elegant men in powdered wigs were debating the language of liberty. Go instead to the camps, the fields outside Boston and New York, where 15,000 men had answered the call to arms. Farmers from Connecticut, blacksmiths from Virginia, shopkeepers from Pennsylvania. They came with their own muskets, some without shoes, most without any understanding of what a professional war actually looked like. They were about to find out. Daily life in the Continental Army in 1776 was an education in suffering. Men slept in tents when they had them, on the bare ground when they did not. Food arrived inconsistently, salt pork, hard biscuit, sometimes nothing at all for days at a stretch. Disease moved through the camps with terrible efficiency. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid. For every soldier killed in battle during the Revolution, roughly 9 died of illness. That ratio haunted every commander, and it haunted Washington most of all. George Washington himself was a man under extraordinary pressure in that year, and the portraits do not show you that. They show you the marble general, the stoic father of a nation. What they do not show you is a man writing desperate letters to Congress at midnight, begging for shoes, for blankets, for gunpowder. A man watching his army evaporate through desertion and expired enlistments, knowing that if the numbers fell too far, there would be nothing left to command. Washington understood something with brutal clarity in 1776. He did not need to defeat the British. He needed to survive them. Survival was the strategy. Keeping the army alive, keeping it in the field, making the war too expensive and too exhausting for a parliament 3,000 miles away. That was the entire plan. But August of 1776 nearly ended it before it had properly begun. Long Island. The British arrived with 32,000 troops, the largest expeditionary force the Empire had ever sent anywhere in the world. Washington had perhaps 19,000 men, and many of them were boys who had never stood in a battle line. The British flanked them, drove through them, and shattered them in a single afternoon. 2,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured. The British lost 400. It was not a defeat. It was a rout. What happened next is one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in military history, and it receives almost none of the attention it deserves. Washington gathered the remnants of his army, 9,000 broken men, and in a single night, in silence, he moved every one of them across the East River. Boats shuttled back and forth through the darkness. No lights, no noise. When dawn came and fog rolled in over the water, the last boats slipped away. Washington, by multiple accounts, was the last man to leave Brooklyn. The British woke to find an empty battlefield. The army had vanished into the mist. He had saved the army, but the weeks that followed were agony. Washington retreated through New Jersey with the British close behind. Men deserted in hundreds, enlistments expired, and soldiers simply walked home, legally because their contracts had ended. By December of 1776, Washington commanded fewer than 2,500 men. 6 days until their enlistments expired. 6 days until there would be no army left at all. This is the moment the revolution actually balanced on. Not the signing of the Declaration, not the first shots at Lexington. It was here, on the freezing banks of the Delaware River, on Christmas night, with a storm howling and ice grinding in the current, that everything was decided. Washington gathered his officers. He had a simple message. They would cross the river. They would march 9 miles through the dark. They would attack a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton at dawn. The password for the operation told you everything about the odds: victory or death. There was no third option. The crossing was chaos. Ice chunks the size of carriages drifted in the black water. The storm shifted between snow, sleet, and freezing rain. The boats were behind schedule. The men were soaked through before they had even landed on the New Jersey shore. Artillery pieces nearly went into the river. Officers cursed and pushed and hauled men into position. And yet they crossed. Every one of them crossed. The Hessians at Trenton were professional soldiers, well-trained, experienced, and utterly unprepared for an army to materialize out of a blizzard on the morning after Christmas. The battle lasted 90 minutes. American casualties: 2 men dead from the cold, 5 wounded in the fighting. Hessian casualties: 22 killed, 83 wounded, 900 taken prisoner. Washington had delivered his men their first real victory in months. And soldiers who had been planning to go home when their enlistments expired, they re-enlisted. The revolution lived another day. What is extraordinary about that winter is how much of the war was fought not with muskets, but with endurance. Think about what ordinary life meant for a Continental soldier. Your uniform, if you had one, was often a coat you owned before the war. Your boots, if they survived the first winter, were repaired with strips of leather cut from whatever came to hand. Pay was irregular and worth less every month as paper money inflated. A soldier's wage that might buy a week's worth of food in 1775 might buy a single loaf of bread in 1778. And through all of it, the drilling continued. The marching continued. Because Washington knew that an army which stopped moving and training was an army that would fall apart. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge is the one that history remembers, and it deserves to be remembered, but not quite in the way it usually is. Valley Forge was not a defeat. It was a transformation. 12,000 men marched into a bare Pennsylvania field in December and built an entire city out of logs in a matter of weeks. They felled trees, constructed huts, laid out streets. It was extraordinary organization under the worst possible conditions. But the conditions were still murderous. 3,000 men would be dead by spring, not from British bullets, but from the cold, from disease, from hunger. And then, into this dying camp, came a Prussian officer who could barely speak English, with an entirely impossible personality and a genius for turning farmers into soldiers. Baron Friedrich von Steuben drilled the Continental Army at Valley Forge with methods he had learned under Frederick the Great, shouting instructions in German that had to be translated into French and then into English before the men could follow them. He swore at them in 3 languages simultaneously. He also ate with them, walked among them, and treated them with a respect they had rarely seen from an officer of any rank. The army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 moved differently. It stood differently. When it met the British at Monmouth that summer, it did not break. It held its line, it used the bayonet, and it fought the most powerful army in the world to a standstill. The British withdrew that night. A line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the revolution, the war was being lived by people who never carried a musket. Women managed farms and businesses while their husbands and sons were away, often for years at a time. They made clothing, preserved food, managed finances, kept communities functioning. In some towns, women organized the boycotts of British goods that had begun the economic pressure on London years before the shooting started. Their contribution was structural and absolute, even if the history books spent 2 centuries largely ignoring it. For enslaved Africans, 1776 carried a specific and devastating irony. The men signing documents about liberty and equality owned human beings, hundreds of them in some cases. Washington himself enslaved over 100 people at Mount Vernon. The Declaration's words, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, were written by a man who owned other men. That contradiction was not invisible at the time. It was debated, argued over, and ultimately set aside, with consequences that would define the next century of American history. The Revolution promised freedom. It delivered it selectively, and the people it excluded knew exactly what was happening. Loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to the crown, lived through the Revolution in a kind of daily terror that is almost entirely absent from the popular memory of the war. At the peak of the conflict, roughly 20% of the colonial population supported the British. They were not traitors or cowards. Many of them believed, with genuine conviction, that independence was reckless, that reconciliation was possible, that ties to Britain were worth preserving. In Patriot-controlled areas, Loyalists had their property seized, their businesses burned, their families threatened. Neighbors who had lived side by side for generations turned on each other overnight. This was not just a war against Britain. It was a civil war inside a revolution, and its wounds ran deep. The French alliance, sealed in 1778 after the American victory at Saratoga, changed the nature of everything. Suddenly, Britain was not fighting colonial farmers. It was fighting France, with all of France's naval power and resources. The war expanded across oceans. British strategic calculations shifted, and the French fleet, when it arrived in American waters at the critical moment in 1781, made possible the final act, the Siege of Yorktown, where 8,000 British soldiers under Cornwallis found themselves surrounded by land and sea, with no escape, no relief, and no choice but to surrender. The band that played as the British marched out to lay down their weapons was reportedly playing a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether that is true or legend hardly matters. The sentiment was accurate. Everything that had seemed impossible 8 years earlier had happened. A collection of colonies with no professional army, no navy, no unified government, and no history as a nation had fought the greatest empire in the world to a standstill and forced a peace on their own terms. And then George Washington did something that astonished the world. He gave it all back. On a cold December day in 1783, in a small room in Annapolis, his hands reportedly shaking, he resigned his commission. 8.5 years of command, the most powerful military position in the new nation, handed back to a civilian Congress. In Europe, victorious generals became emperors. Washington went home to his farm. When King George III was told what Washington had done, he said that if this were true, Washington would be the greatest man in the world. It was true, and for once, a king was right. What the revolution truly was, at its core, was an argument about power, who holds it, where it comes from, and what happens when it is abused. That argument did not end in 1783. It did not end with the Constitution. It has never ended. Every generation inherits it, and has to answer it again in its own terms. The men and women of 1776 answered it in mud and cold and fear and extraordinary, improbable courage. The shot nobody fired intentionally echoed for centuries, and somewhere in that echo a nation found its voice.